Have you ever heard the saying, the writing is on the wall? Today we're going to look in chapter 5 of Daniel in his life as he meets a new king and there's a new event that comes in his life. We've been going through a series we call Counterculture, and over the last several weeks we've been going through the life of Daniel and his friends, and we have watched Daniel in the face of a brand new culture and a brand new world stay true to his beliefs in God. Today, as we talk about the writing on the wall, we're going to look at this story of how Daniel was the only one, again, capable of translating this event, the writing on the wall, so to speak. Last week we saw the end of Nebuchadnezzar as his reign came to a close, or came to an end. His pride got the better of him, and he ended up giving God the glory, but the higher pride takes you, the farther it'll drop you. And that was our main idea from last week. This week, we close the book on Nebuchadnezzar, and we open a new chapter with a new king, but the same Daniel. Although there are new players on the board, the same problem still exists and persists. What happens when a culture disrespects God? What happens when the culture no longer values the holiness and sacredness of God, but grows numb to it? It is a dangerous place to be in when you no longer respect the sacredness of God. See, when God is no longer someone or something, it is a dangerous place to be in. And this kind of identifies our culture today, is that God has no longer become someone to trust, but something to disrespect. Let me ask you a question. What if God literally gave you a sign on the wall? What if he took his finger and he wrote out your future? With one king, God was patient, but with another, God swiftly took action. Regardless of where we are, if we disrespect God or we grow numb to the sacredness of God, we have got to come to a conclusion or come to a point in our life that we need to start respecting God. So if we open up in chapter 5, it says, many years later, King Belshazzar gave a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking the wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver cups that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to drink from them with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. So they brought these gold cups taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. While they drank from them, they praised their idols made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So before we get any further, the first point I have for you is that disrespect often comes from ignorance. And what I mean by that is that if we ignorantly live our lives oblivious to God, and our culture has defined themselves from distancing themselves from God and living apart from God, then we often find ourselves, or the culture finds themselves, disrespecting God. See, several years later, after the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar had ended, a new king, Belshazzar, decided to hold a feast to impress the elite and the wealthy. He decided to drink with them, and while in doing so, he ordered that they bring in the gold and silver cups that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem. The same cups that were set apart to honor and glorify God, now were going to be used to disrespect God. He took something that was meant to honor God and then use it to praise idols made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. These false gods. This new king had not experienced the power of Daniel's God like the old one. Yet, I'm sure he had heard the stories, even testimonies from people that had been there or witnessed Daniel's wisdom and Daniel's ability to interpret these dreams and being an advisor to the king. And even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's story, I'm sure, went through all over the country and the kingdom, and people had heard how God supernaturally had protected them. Still, the king chose to ignore what he had been told and do what he wanted. If you skip, before we get to the next part, if you look at verse 22 and verse 23, God says this through Daniel. He says, "You are his successor, O Belshazzar, King Nebuchadnezzar's successor. You knew all of this, yet you have not humbled yourself, for you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven, and have had these cups from his temple brought before you. You and your nobles, your wives and concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that neither see nor hear nor know anything at all. But you have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny." So we see here, it is one thing to hear the stories of God. It is another to experience them. And this might be the biggest reason, or one of the biggest reasons why our culture has disrespected God, is because they've not experienced the power and presence of God, but only heard stories from it. To our culture, God is just simply a story, nothing more. But God is so much more than a story. We see in this story here that disrespect, and this is point number 2, disrespect for God can be contagious. The king was the most influential person in the room. It was by his choice he chose to disrespect the God of Daniel. Yet everyone else began to follow. People as a group are followers. There are very few leaders left today. Leaders are the ones that shape our culture. And that's the key here. And that's what we need to understand, is that if our culture is disrespecting God, we need leaders that are going to stand up to glorify and honor God, so that they can show that God is very real and God has a presence in your life that can change your life. See, more and more people today are disrespecting God. Just as disrespect can be contagious, so can be being faithful to God. We need to stand up for our faith and lead others to Jesus. It says that not only was the king drinking from this, but also all of his nobles, all of their wives and their servants, all of them were drinking and disrespecting God together. But a culture that disrespects God will still notice the presence of God. As we continue in this story, as the king and his party continued with their disrespectful behavior, a supernatural event happened. Look at verse 5. Suddenly, they saw the fingers of a human hand writing on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace near the lampstand. The king saw the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale with fright. His knees knocked together in fear, and his legs gave way beneath him. And the king was frightened and terrified because God literally stuck his finger out in their presence and began writing on the wall. So the king shouted for the enchanters, the astrologers, the fortune tellers to be brought before him. He said to these wise men of Babylon, "What is meant by this writing on the wall?" He says, "If you can tell me, I'll dress you in purple robes and of royal honor and have a gold chain placed around your neck. He will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." But when all the king's wise men had come in, none of them could read or tell him what it meant. So the king became even more alarmed, and his face turned pale. His nobles too were shaken. This kind of sounds familiar, right? If we go back to the several times that Daniel had stepped in to interpret the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar. Here again, the astrologers, the wisest men in all of Babylon, could not interpret the writing on the wall. They didn't know what it meant. And so God had wrote out the future of King Belshazzar on the wall, and he didn't even know what it meant. Yet his mom, if we look in verse 8, verse 10, it says, "But when the queen mother had heard what was happening, she hurried to the banquet hall. She said to her son, 'Long live the king. Don't be so pale and frightened. There is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During the king Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight, understanding, and wisdom like no other before him. And the king made him his chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers of Babylon. This man, Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar, has exceptional ability and is filled with divine knowledge and understanding. He can tell you what it means.'" So the king brought Daniel before him. And what was written on the wall were these words, "Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsons." Now, you were like, "Well, I don't understand what that means." So Daniel tells him, he says, "Keep your gifts, give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means, your majesty." He says, "God has sovereignty and glory and honor to your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. He made him so great that people of all races, nations, language trembled before him in fear. He says, you are his successor. We read this a while ago. And you knew all of this. You knew what King Nebuchadnezzar had done. You had heard the stories of how his pride made him fall, and he lived in 7 years in the wilderness, but came to himself and finally gave God the glory and honor. You knew this, but yet you still, it says that, for you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and had these cups praising your own gods and not the God who gives you breath and life and controls your destiny. So Daniel, again, was the only one able to interpret the writing on the wall. God blessed Daniel with his faithfulness yet again. So the Mene Tekel Parsons, this is what it means. The message for the king Belshazzar says this. It said, God has numbered your days and brought it to an end, and you have been weighed and have not measured up. Your kingdom will now be divided by the Medes and the Persians. Daniel was recognized for his ability to do once again what others could not do. See, in our culture, they're going to be able to see the presence of God in someone. And I've said this before other times, but the greatest testimony that you could ever have, the greatest tool and weapon that you could have to share your faith with people is the testimony of your life being changed and living for God. So you could tell people all day long they need to come to God, that they are disrespecting God with their lives, their selfish ways, and their sin, and that God is calling them to come back. And you can preach and preach and preach, but if they do not see that you believe what you're preaching, they won't believe one word that you have to say. Your life is a living testimony to what God has done in your life. So Daniel was recognized once again for his ability to do so, what others could not do. God had worked through Daniel, and because of his faithfulness, Daniel was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Immediately after this, look at this. So Belshazzar, the writing on the wall, he says, your days are going to be brought to an end. You have been weighed and not measured up. Your kingdom will now be divided by the Medes and the Persians. So you think, okay, eventually this is going to happen. But right after Daniel is proclaimed the third highest ruler, and they put, he was dressed in purple robes, verse 29, a gold chain was hung around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, look at verse 30, the Babylonian king was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. I mean, it wasn't even like years later. It was that very same night, the words of God, the prophecy of God came true, and Belshazzar wasted his life after disrespecting God, now was taken off the board. And the Babylonians were overthrown by the Medes and the Persians, and Darius became the new king of the country of Babylon, now is considered under the rule of the Medes and the Persians. See, culture will recognize the presence of God, and this is where it comes down to what it means for you and I. The reason so many disrespect God is because they have never seen or experienced the presence of God in their lives. This is where we come in. We need to be the presence of God in this world. We need to be ambassadors, speaking on God's behalf, showing the world who God is and what God has done. It is time to step up and be the presence of God to a culture that openly disrespects God. So where are you? Are you standing for God? Are you stepping up where you need to be in a culture that disrespects God and standing true to your faith and your beliefs and showing people that God is very real. He is more than a story. He is not something to be disrespected, but He is someone to be glorified and praised. So I ask you, where are you at? Where do you stand? See, we'll see next week what happens when you stand for God and people don't like it. As we conclude our study in the life of Daniel, and we look at chapter 6 next week as we talk about facing the lions. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this has helped you to understand the need that we have to stand in our faith in a world that disrespects God. So we'll see you guys next week.